I suppose one of the first lessons for me would be don't follow a guy who just climbed Everest. But I promise you, the Mac was my Everest. It caused as much self-learning as I think others might experience in the ascent of that amazing mountain. The process of funding, generating support for, designing, opening the Mac has been the most frustrating, fear-inducing, energizing, joy-filled, life-enhancing experience of my life. Base camp was in May 1996 when I had my first conversation with a consultant about the idea of creating a new arts centre in the city centre, and it wasn't my idea. It was fully the support of the Arts Council in Belfast City Council, that idea, who realised that there was a gap that needed to be filled. And in the intervening years between that, May 1996, and when we actually began to build on the 11th of December 2009, support came from DSD, DCAL, SIB, and even with all of that support, all those funders who pledged significant amount of money and gave it their support, it was still incredibly difficult to achieve. We call those years development hell, and in those years, the lesson I learned was that the stakes were really high. It's kind of like people who work in movies talk about being stuck in development hell. And as I think about it, if you get to make a movie, you're a winner. And if you don't, you're a guy who's walking around town with an unmade script in his back pocket. If we got to build the Mac, my goodness, how amazing would that be? And if we didn't, we were mad people who'd wasted 14 years of our lives talking nonsense about something that didn't happen. But it did. And it's amazing. And when I say we, I really do mean we. It was never just me. There were at least 6 of us who did it. A very small team and a wonderful team of trustees. One of the first lessons for me was that the human brain has a really big problem with abstract concepts. Abstract concepts are very hard to catch hold of. And I realized this when you can imagine how much talk there was in our house about the Mac. Every meal time, I have 4 children, and the 2 youngest, who are twins, who are now 7.5, grew up with the concept of the Mac. And yet, just as we'd begun to build the building, myself and my 4 kids and my wonderful husband were walking through St. Anne's Square, and they were just starting to build it. And I stopped the kids, and I turned them around and said, "That's the Mac." And Ellen, who was the youngest, said, "The Mac's a building?" At that point I realised, okay, we are exhausting ourselves trying to build public awareness within Belfast and Northern Ireland about this thing that just doesn't exist. We can't make it exist sooner than it does. So let's just wait. The brain needs to be able to see and touch and feel and smell before it really understands. And again, for me, I knew that very well and personally, because as a client, the lead person in the team who was the client who was building the Mac, I have absolutely no sense of direction. I once almost lost the CAL committee in the course of taking them around the building as it was being built. I have no spatial awareness, and I absolutely could not read plans. I just couldn't do it. My husband gets terribly anxious, really annoyed, and goes, "You know, if you really concentrated, you could get from A to B. I just can't." So whenever the architect showed me that, it didn't matter how wonderful they were and are, I could never understand that it was going to become that and that. And when they showed me the first floor plans, I didn't get that it was going to someday be that and that. And so it was through a very long process, which was really, in retrospect, about building trust between the client and the architect, that we really began to test out and believe that our aesthetic sensibilities matched, that what Hackett Hall McKnight, the architects, liked, we liked, and what they didn't like, we didn't like. And that got us through some very difficult times. Which brought me on to, this brings me on to one of my other things which I learned was, accept what you're not good at, which is one of the great joys of being 46 rather than 26. When I was 26 and I couldn't do something, I thought it was because I was rubbish. And I think that goes back to when I was 10 and was pitched in as a budding violinist into an orchestra with all my contemporaries, And I had been taught the G, D, and A strings of the violin, but not the E string, which is a bit of a disadvantage. Now, I was really good on the G, D, and A strings. Declan and Andy earlier, they were quite good. I was as good as them on the G, D, and A. Well, no, that's not true. I was a bit better. But not so good on the E string. And as a 10-year-old, I thought that was my fault. Actually, it was my violin teacher's fault. So the long process of going from 10 to 46 helped me arrive at the point, as a client of the MAC, where I realized, okay, if I can't read plans, I just can't. Our architects, bless them, are going to have to help me understand. So we went through a long process, which included really sort of anodyne things, such as, I genuinely don't understand what 1 square meter means. Some people do, I don't. Nor do I understand what 55,000 square meters means, which is the size of the MAC, with its 2 theatres and 3 galleries and cafe and bar and 4 workshop spaces and dance studio and rehearsal space and offices for 4 resident arts groups and a den for young people's work and an artist in residence studio. I don't get what 55,000 square meters is. So we told people, because if I don't, there's some other people out there who also don't, that it was the same as 65 3-bedroom semi-detached houses. And at one point in the process of introducing the MAC to Northern Ireland, it was important to try and help people understand that it was quite big. So that was quite useful. One of the worst things anybody ever said to me was, good clients get good buildings. It was an architect. And you can see where the transfer of blame is loaded in that statement. It was a tough one, but it was really, really useful. Because one of the things we knew was what we didn't know. You remember Donald Rumsfeld, that great orator and theorist of our time? We know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. We knew what we didn't know. We knew that we wanted to create a world-class building. We wanted to create a world-class arts centre that was going to really allow artists to reach the outer edges of their capabilities and to not limit their potential. But we weren't quite sure how to do it. And one of the reasons we knew that it was really difficult was that in those development years from 1996 to 2009, we'd gone round lots of other new arts buildings. And some of them were quite beautiful. But for us, an important statement about the arts building that we were going to build was that it would work as a really hardcore, high-functioning art space where artists could fly. So where mistakes had been made in other buildings, kind of real howlers like not inadequate storage space, but no storage space. Or acoustics, in a performative space, in a theatre where the acoustics just aren't good enough. Or one of my worst nightmares was a space where the technician who's sitting in the control booth at the back of the theatre, whose job it is to line up the cues for the light and sound, all very tightly calibrated as the actors come on and move around the stage. When he sat down in the control booth, he couldn't actually see the stage. Again and again, we asked the same question, how did this happen? Because invariably, the front of house facilities were gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. But the back of house spaces, the real hardcore, hardworking factory type spaces, seemed to get shortchanged again and again. And the answer became very clear. It's kind of a boring phrase, but there was insufficient engagement with the end users. The client sometimes, the decision-making member of the client team, was sometimes so far removed, 1 million miles away from the people who are actually going to be running and using the buildings, they didn't know the issues, they didn't know what the questions were. And then aligning that with architects, apologies to any architects in the room, who sometimes have an amazing capacity to present themselves as having all the answers, those two things together combined to create situations where mistakes were made. I have to say, there is no such thing as a perfect building. The MAC is far from being a perfect building because it's kind of an existential thing which freaks me out. As soon as you actually build walls and put roofs on things, you've limited the capabilities you've made, and lots and lots of choices. Some of them will be right and some of them will be wrong. But what we did in order to try and really, really own this fact that you don't know what you don't know was to surround ourselves in the design process with the end users. So rather than, I'm all for reducing my responsibility and pushing the blame onto others. So rather than saying, yes, I built it, we had a blank sheet and we screwed it up, rather than that being the case, We got actors and dancers and musicians and poets and curators and visual artists and set designers and lighting designers to come with us and design it with us. Each of the spaces in the MAC was designed with artists, and it's not perfect, but that's a beautiful visual art space. You have to come and see it. That was a dance studio, and that's one of the walls. These are all empty spaces which are now completely chocker. There's Meryl. One of the other things I learned was, you know the old adage that success attracts success, and people love to be attracted to success? That's true. But one of the other things I learned was that sometimes some people will take a risk. Sometimes some people will give generously of themselves. I have 13 trustees who sat in cold, drafty rooms when there were many occasions that it looked as if the MAC was never going to happen, and they stayed with the process. We have 120 volunteers, or MACtivists, in the MAC, who don't get paid to come and spend their free time in the MAC. And we always, I genuinely think the MACtivists, our volunteers, are like us, only much better, because they're not stressed out and exhausted. They're there because they genuinely love what it is we're doing and they want to be part of it. Meryl came and launched our capital fundraising campaign at the end of 2007. And one of the things I'm asked most often was, how did you get Meryl? And the answer is the same answer that Woody Allen gave whenever a rather impertinent journalist asked him how he, Woody Allen, the speckled, 5'7", slightly balding, very idiosyncratic Woody Allen, how did he manage to date and marry some of the world's most beautiful women? And his answer was, I had access. We had access to Meryl. One of my friends who produced my husband's movie, Mark Huffam, was producing Mamma Mia. And Meryl was in London, and all that meant was that we could get a letter into her hand. That is one of the big hurdles to get over. The other reason we got Meryl was because she got it. She has lived her life espousing the benefits of art, the transformative effect that art can have. And while so much attention has and will continue to be focused on the building, for us, it was always all about the art. The building, the least the MAC is an exquisite work of art as a building. It is world-class in terms of architecture, but that's the least it is, because it's the alchemy that happens inside it. It's the experiences that people will actually take away with them, having seen the most amazing piece of theatre, that will actually make it be a space that people remember. So in terms of the art, just to say, in these terribly difficult times, when obviously public spending is under really hard scrutiny, it is sometimes worth just taking a moment and pausing for people like me to do a little bit of proselytizing to people like you, which is about the power of art and the value of art. Given the fact that so much in Northern Ireland has changed in such a short number of years, but it's still the case, I genuinely believe, that there is real value in having a space where artists can experiment and people, regardless of the limitations of their lives, whether they're physical, geographic, economic, educational, have the opportunity to be transported, because the arts, good art, can change the way we look at the world around us. And that's not nothing. Art can cause us to make connections with our past, and it can help push open a door to the future. And that can sometimes be uncomfortable, but it's terribly important, because if a society isn't examining itself and considering where it's come from and where it might go, it will obviously run the risk of repeating old mistakes. It has the opportunity of allowing people to come together collectively rather than individually. It gives us a chance to poke sticks in places where there's stagnation. It shines light in dark wee spaces. And if you've gone to the theatre and been bored to tears, let me tell you the reason that happened was because the theatre wasn't good enough. It is not that you don't like theatre, or dance, or music, or visual art. It's just that it happened not to speak to you, or it didn't quite work. Give it another chance. Yeah, the other thing which I feel really strongly about is, given the fact that my oldest child is 14 and the second one is soon to be 12, so much of what the most recent generation born experiences is through screens. So much of how they receive entertainment through the multi-platform channels is to do with non-interactive activity. There is nothing to substitute for the real flesh and blood, the real spit and gore, and the real in-the-flesh arts engagement that you get in the theatre. I think that's worth valuing, and that's what we value in the MAC. And before I get too wordy on you, nowadays, obviously, we're all about social media, and we talk to our customers in a million different ways. You know what, we tweet it. In the old days, in the previous venue, we used to have the scrappiest of all scrapbooks, and it used to sit on a really rickety table as people were leaving the theatre. And it was our comment book, and we asked people to write their comments about what they'd just seen in the theatre. And it was great. It was really great. But that's why it's not only about the art, it's about the audience's experience with the art. It's about that interaction. But that's where the value lies. And, you know, Sheila from Newton Arts, I read it out because it hasn't come through very clearly. After this show was something a taxi driver in Liverpool saw. She said, "This show has changed my life. I will never look at the world in the same way again." That is a verbatim transcription of what the customer wrote. And then we had Tom from Belfast. A different show. Verbatim. No embellishment. One of my favourite things to do in the MAC is to sort of hunker at the back of the stairs and watch people as they come up the stairs into the Robert Therrien piece, which we have in the MAC at the moment. He's a world-renowned artist. And they walk up the stairs and they just explode with joy. People just go, I can't do it because I'm wearing a mic. They just roar with joy. That's what that can do. And finally, it was one of my favourite. I've been schlepping people around the MAC when it was a building site for years to try and help them understand what it was before it existed. And at one point I would stop and talk about this artwork. What you see in terms of the prism of light there is an artwork that was co-commissioned between the MAC and the Thomas Devlin Fund. It's an artwork by Mark Gary, and it's called The Permanent Present. It's an in-situ permanent artwork, and the Thomas Devlin Fund was created by Penny Holloway and Jim Devlin. Thomas Devlin's parents, they created the fund after Thomas was murdered in an unprovoked attack in August 2005 when he was coming back from the shops with his mates after having bought sweets. Penny and Jim came 2 years after Thomas was murdered and said that they wanted to create an artwork for the MAC, in the MAC, with the MAC, because of what the MAC represented. They wanted to make some kind of comment on the futility of violence against young people, but they also wanted it to be very high profile in building, contemplative in nature, and be very aspirational. They wanted to be looking forward, and of course that fits so neatly in terms of all that the MAC is and can be. And when I tried to describe this artwork in its absence to people, I told them that, but then I ended by saying, it'll look like there's a rainbow in the MAC. And where this photograph is taken, there's a little, we call it the landing, there's a little space that's kind of hidden from view, and we have meetings in it. And last week, I was having a meeting in the building, and I heard this just outrageous argument outside on the landing as there were 3 little kids, and they must have been no more than 5 or 6, were standing looking over it, and one was saying, "It is!" And everyone was going, "It isn't!" And everyone said, "It is! It is a rainbow!" That's something. I'm really glad that we get to have a rainbow in the MAC, and that kids are fighting about whether it is or is not real. The MAC has been open for 5.5 weeks, and we've welcomed 51,637 people. It's a great resource for all of us in Northern Ireland. I think we are at our best when we're engaging in arts activity, whether we're watching, listening, viewing, or doing. So come and join us. Thanks a lot.